The power plants that now leave Sevastopol in the dark were personally inaugurated by Vladimir Putin as proof that Crimea would never again go dark. But those same plants depend on European turbines that Russia can no longer buy, repair, or replace, and that has turned the greatest symbol of the annexation into its greatest weakness. And that is not even the strangest part of the story. What is happening on the peninsula right now goes far beyond a blackout. There is a methodical, quiet, and growing plan dismantling Russia's ability to keep Crimea running piece by piece. And what comes next explains why Russian drivers are being forced to abandon their own cars in the middle of the road. To understand the irony behind this energy collapse, you have to go back to 2014, when Russia illegally annexed the peninsula and promised the world it would turn Crimea into a showcase of modernity. Two of the region's main thermal power plants, located in Balaclava and Tavrida, were equipped with German-made turbines produced by Siemens. The problem is that those turbines reached Russia through a workaround that skirted international sanctions, since the European Union had explicitly banned the sale of that kind of technology for use in Crimea. Here is the part that matters most. Moscow built its proudest symbol of power on a foundation it sabotaged with its own hands. Every strike on those plants is not just damage, it is damage Russia legally cannot fix, because the same sanctions it tried to dodge to build them now block any Western company from repairing them. That is not resilience. That is a trap Putin set for himself. It was exactly that vulnerability that Ukraine decided to exploit. In a series of nighttime strikes, Ukrainian forces hit the electrical infrastructure that powers Sevastopol directly, cutting power to trams, traffic lights, street lights, and communication systems. According to outlets like the Kyiv Independent and the Moscow Times, residents reported entire nights without light, with families relying on portable generators and candles to get through the dark. But energy was only the first target in a much broader architecture, one that sources tied to Ukraine's unmanned systems, forces describe as a genuine logistics lockdown. Instead of trying to retake Crimea with a massive ground offensive that would cost lives on an unacceptable scale, Ukraine chose to strangle the peninsula from within, cutting off everything that lets it function as a military base and an administered territory. Fuel was the second pillar to fall, after strikes on oil terminals and depots in the region, including facilities near Kerch. Occupation authorities suspended fuel sales to civilians, reserving what remained for services considered essential to security. BBC reports documented ordinary drivers describing endless lines and completely empty gas stations. In a scene that circulated among Telegram monitoring channels, a family of Russian tourists from Moscow was caught in a cafe in the town of Balaclava, discussing something that would have seemed unthinkable months earlier, leaving their own car in a parking lot and taking crowded public buses to try to leave the peninsula, because there simply was no gasoline being sold to civilians. Rail transport suffered the same fate. The number of trains running daily between Crimea and the rest of Russian territory dropped from 18 to just 7, according to data cited by the Kyiv Independent. And the most symbolic blow came when Ukrainian special forces announced the destruction of a railway bridge over the North Crimean Canal near the village of Rozdolny, calling it the first in a series of structures that would, in their own words, cease to exist. That bridge was part of a transport corridor used to move cargo, resources, and military supplies toward Russian troops positioned in southern Ukraine. With its destruction, occupation authorities were forced to suspend passenger train service within Crimea itself, keeping only the city of Kerch, at the peninsula's eastern tip, as the starting and ending point for travel to and from the Russian mainland. But perhaps the most revealing figure in this entire campaign is not about energy or fuel, but about the sky. Ukraine has dedicated a significant share of its resources, including an additional fund of $100 million, to expanding a new class of medium-range drones capable of flying up to 200 kilometers and striking specifically at logistics networks in the Russian rear. In a single night, Ukrainian forces carried out a sweep against 60 simultaneous targets in Crimea and other occupied areas, including oil storage tanks at the Kerch thermal power station and an electrical substation in the Kerch area, along with Russian air defense systems of the S-300, S-400, and Panzer S-1 models. A high-tech radar of the Nebo-U model, used for aerial and space detection, was also destroyed, along with military aircraft hangars at the Saki and Gvardiiska airfields. The commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, Robert Brovdy, publicly confirmed part of these operations on social media, treating each strike not as an isolated event but as part of a deliberate doctrine. Sources tied to Ukraine's Ministry of Defense describe that doctrine in almost surgical terms. A target is not simply hit once. Days later, reconnaissance drones return to assess the damage, and if Russian repair crews are sent to the site, they themselves become the new target. This is a good point for a quick aside. If you have made it this far, you have probably noticed this channel does not deal in sensationalism or easy predictions. Our commitment is to analyze conflicts, military technology, and geopolitics in depth, cross-referencing independent sources to deliver the most complete picture possible. If that kind of analysis speaks to you, consider subscribing to the channel, because what comes next completely changes how the future of Crimea should be understood. Because behind every destroyed drone and every bridge that ceases to exist, there is a human cost that technical reports rarely capture. In Yalta, a small business owner named Maxim had taken out a loan the year before to renovate tourist cabins, hoping to pay off his debts during the summer season. But tourism bookings on the peninsula plunged 58% in the weeks leading up to this wave of attacks, and businesses like Maxim's simply stopped getting customers. This kind of everyday collapse is what lies behind a decision that would seem almost comical at first glance if it did not reveal so much desperation. Occupation authorities banned nighttime use of motorcycles and electric scooters on the peninsula. The official justification cites public safety. But here is the plain reading of it. When a government has to ban scooters to feel safe, that is not caution. That is an admission it can no longer control its own skies. And the inevitable result of all this accumulated pressure came in the form of an admission Russia would hardly want to make. Occupation authorities declared a state of emergency in Crimea, a territory Vladimir Putin has always treated as sacred and irreversible. Call it whatever Moscow wants to call it. A government does not declare a state of emergency in territory it fully controls. It declares one in territory it is losing its grip on. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been direct about the purpose of these operations. According to him, every strike is carefully calculated, not just to cause immediate damage, but to force Russia to seriously consider the path toward peace negotiations. Experts interviewed by the Wall Street Journal, including former Ukrainian Defense Minister Andriy Zagorodnyuk, back up that reading, noting that Kyiv's strategy is strictly operational. While Russia directs much of its firepower at Ukrainian civilian infrastructure in a manner analysts describe as psychological and terror-driven, Ukraine concentrates its efforts on the logistics nodes that sustain the Russian military presence on the peninsula, deliberately avoiding targets that would maximize civilian casualties. But there is one final piece on this board that has not yet fallen, and it could be the most decisive moment of the entire campaign. The Kerch Bridge, built in 2018 and inaugurated by Putin himself as the ultimate symbol of the annexation, is the last land and rail link remaining between Crimea and mainland Russia. It has already been targeted at least 3 times before, but it still stands, though partially damaged. According to recent reports, strikes have already hit vessels and maritime logistics infrastructure on both sides of the Kerch Strait, including a ferry used to cross the region, leaving casualties among Russian civilians. Sources tied to Ukraine's military intelligence service say the bridge remains formally mapped within Ukraine's plans for definitive destruction. What we are witnessing, then, is not a series of random attacks. It is the systematic transformation of Crimea from a strategic asset Putin once displayed as proof of power into a liability that grows more expensive and harder to sustain by the day. A territory does not stay a trophy when its population lives under a curfew on scooters. Its tourists have vanished, its trains have nearly stopped running, and its last bridge home is formally marked as a target. That is not occupation holding steady. That is occupation running out of runway. Given all of this, one reflection remains that may be more unsettling than any number presented here. If a symbol Vladimir Putin inaugurated with so much fanfare has in just a few years become the clearest evidence of Russian fragility in the region, do you believe Crimea will still be a year from now what the Kremlin insists on calling sacred territory? Or has it already become in practice the greatest strategic burden of the war?